The last Torah portion in the book of Numbers, called Bamidbar, deals with the travels of the people of Israel throughout the desert, going from Egypt to the Promised Land. There are 42 different stopovers. They are recorded here in order. And one wonders, what is the reason why the Torah reviews all 42 trips? Why is it necessary when we could just go back and read it and remind ourselves, what's the purpose of identifying them? What's the purpose of identifying the places that we don't even know where they are today? And there are different approaches to the travels and the travails of the Jewish people. Let me try to go through them. There are three different directions that you can take. The people of Israel should have gone directly into the Promised Land almost immediately after they were given the Torah. But they had to travel for an additional 38 and a half years because they sinned. And so the travels were the result of their many sins, and they had to compensate for what they had lacked in faith by the difficulties that ensued in their travels. That would be the first approach to Torah. The more philosophic approach of Maimonides would be as follows. A human being goes through life in order to reach a higher understanding. If a person lacks understanding, then the purpose of the travails of life are meant to lead the person to a higher understanding and a higher appreciation of his surroundings. A lot of times the person isn't ready for the ultimate message of the Torah, and therefore the person must go through different kinds of events and different kinds of tests in order to ultimately get the proper perspective and be able to view God and view himself and view the people and the world in the proper context. And so the Torah reviews the travels, telling us that in order to be able to become an independent person ready to take on responsibility, the people of Israel had to go through travels to become self-reliant, to become the kind of people who are ready to take on the responsibility of fulfilling God's desire in the Holy Land. So the purpose was not a punishment. It was in order to raise their consciousness to a higher perspective. The Hasidic approach is that everything that happens is by divine providence. And we had to go through 42 different camps because these are 42 different stopovers or levels of the soul. And each soul has 42 levels to reach in order to get to the Promised Land from its own level of being an animal, being associated with an animal. Where you see the human being has got a godly soul and an animal soul. And we are sometimes swamped by the animal soul. And this is Egypt, because Egypt represents Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim comes from the word Meitzar, a difficult place, a place where things surround you. You are enveloped by something that you don't like. In this case, the animal instinct. And it takes, although in some places it says 49 levels, it takes 42 different levels to come out of the husk and to be able to reach the level of purity necessary to come into the land of Israel. But these are 42 distinct levels that the person must go through. Not that these are meant just to raise the consciousness, but these are 42 different steps, each one significant, each one important, without which the person couldn't reach the next level. And so, how are we supposed to view life and the travails of life? Person has gone through a life 50, 60, 70 years, and suddenly finds himself closer to death, realizing that he's wasted most of his life. A person could think, well, I'll do what I can with what I have left. And the person becomes an observant person. And if he's Jewish, he becomes an observant Jew, following the Torah meticulously. And so one might say that the person found God at the end of his life. And the last few years were good. But Chassidus says no. In order to reach that perspective that he had to get to in his later years, he had to live through his life. And that all of the steps of his life actually participated in making the person who he was, so that he could have that particular kind of spiritual experience. And this is the concept that's found in the Talmud, that when a person does teshuvah, a person returns to God with all of his heart and love, he actually transforms his sins into goodness. Because you see, even the sins are a trip. Even the sins are stepping stones to a higher level if viewed properly, if the person takes the proper action.